As the COVID-19 outbreak intensifies, Indigenous communities, particularly those in remote areas, will need resources to combat the pandemic. Today's federal aid package earmarked funds for Indigenous services. But is it enough? And what are Indigenous leaders aiming to ask the feds during tomorrow's First Ministers meeting? Let's find out with someone who will be at the table. The Assembly of First Nations National Chief Bellegarde joins me in studio. And thank you very much for being here to talk about this. So yeah, coronavirus is going to be talked about. Yeah. What these communities are going to need. What are you going to bring to the table? What are you going to say about some of the money? We don't know how much is going to be earmarked to them, but what's needed?
I think more, we have 96 isolated communities, remote flying communities. And so there's got to be a very specific strategy or plan in place to meet their needs, because some of them don't have potable water or water to even wash their hands. So you need sanitizer. You know, so there's already overcrowded housing. So there's got to be a very specific strategy and plan for those isolated communities. They don't have access to hospitals. They have nursing stations, which are basically underfunded and overcrowded and not meeting the needs already. So out of these resources that are going to be planned for, there's got to be a very specific strategy to ensure those needs of those isolated communities are met.
And if this gets into the Indigenous communities, and as you said with the water issues, washing hands is not going to be the answer for so many of them.
I think you're going to have to look at having access so you can move them out of the community into the hospitals where they can get proper care. So you might, if you need planes to move them out, like, you know, will we have access to D&D? Like, who knows? Like, this is going to be, if it hits the communities that are isolated, it's going to be rampant. It's going to spread very fast. And so there's got to be some very, very specific plans and strategies to meet the needs that are going to be there. And so that's going to be the message we bring forward tomorrow to both the Prime Minister and to the Premiers. And
were you disappointed that there wasn't anything specific within, I mean, the $150 million that was allocated for research, for public health, and for Indigenous? We don't know how much that is, but we do know a lot's needed.
No, there's definitely needs there. Like, just people got to get their heads around, these are isolated communities. They don't have access to hospitals. You know, they're nursing stations, and those nursing stations are currently understaffed already. So obviously there's going to be greater needs. So again, just to stress the point, we better plan properly. There better be a proper strategy in place with both human and financial resources to meet the needs that are there, because this will spread very quickly.
Officials have been saying throughout the coronavirus, we have learned many, many lessons from previous outbreaks like SARS, like H1N1, but Indigenous communities were hit really hard during H1N1.
No question. Like the healthcare status of First Nations people, you got to deal with the social determinants of health. You know, so you need proper housing. Well, we're still fighting for that, right? You need clean drinking water, potable water. Well, we're still fighting. It's moving the right direction from 137 down to 57. So it's moving the right way, but there's still huge needs that have to be dealt with and focused on. So it's kind of like, let's maintain the momentum with proper investments in education and housing and water and infrastructure so that these basic fundamental human rights, needs of our people are met.
So once you're going to be presenting, you can have a chance to talk about these things. And in addition to preparing for or properly equipping these communities, what else do you want to bring to the table?
Oh, there's a number of issues. We can see in the past number of weeks, you know, the economic instability or economic uncertainty, you know, and the economies across Canada. And I say, you're going to have economic uncertainties and conflicts that will arise when Aboriginal rights and title and jurisdiction aren't recognized. And so I'm going to bring to the table, let's embrace the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a roadmap to reconciliation. And before you try to build anything, build a respectful relationship with the rights and title holders. That's going to be something we bring forward, because once that happens, you're going to have a province that's ripe for economic investment. You're going to have an environment where people will want to come and build capital because they're going to know the rules. Both private sector, the industry, provincial governments, and First Nations governments involve the Indigenous people sooner than later, and you're going to find the balance between the economy and the environment.
Well, and let me ask you about, okay, so the blockades are all now down, you know, and the pipeline protests, because there's this agreement in place. We don't know a lot about it, but are you positive looking ahead in terms of how that relationship is going to go when you talk about title and deed?
I think, you know, there's a huge opportunity right at our fingertips here, a huge opportunity to fix outdated policies that the federal crown has when it comes to land rights. So you have this comprehensive claims policy. Well, it's outdated. It's based on termination of rights and title and jurisdiction, not recognition of rights and title and jurisdiction. So let's fix that. You know, we've had the Delgamuukw decision, the Supreme Court of Canada decision, that has never been implemented. So we have a huge opportunity now to get it done and get it right. And once that's done, that creates surety, that creates stability, that creates knowledge of the rules of the game, so to speak. So let's fix, I don't even like using the word land claims. Let's call it land restoration. You know, land restoration for Indigenous peoples. And that will deal with that piece. And then we also have to deal with the governance piece about how we're moving beyond the Indian Act, because you have the Indian Act system and the traditional hereditary system. And I always say to the Wet'suwet'en peoples, you must involve all of your people, the matriarchs, the clans, the house leaders, the elected chiefs and councils, and work it out as the Wet'suwet'en nation, according to their own laws and traditions and governance systems. And that's a challenge now moving forward. So I think it's a huge opportunity.
And yesterday we saw in Ottawa there was a former hereditary chief of Wet'suwet'en who spoke in Ottawa and basically said this is a bad deal. It was a bad deal from the beginning, that these hereditary chiefs hijacked the whole agenda, that they were bolstered by environmentalists, and that it shouldn't go forward.
Well, there's that whole aspect about was it First Nations protesting or was it the environmental movement? You know, I don't even want to go there. I see this as an opportunity to bring all people together. I see this as an opportunity for the Wet'suwet'en people, all the Wet'suwet'en people, to come together to make a decision on their governance structure and whether or not this proceeds. Because I've said before, we as a people, not only in Canada but throughout the world, have to get our head around climate change. And we have to get our dependency off of fossil fuels and move towards clean energy. But we say we want to be part of the economy. We want to look at equity ownership. We want to create jobs for our people, create wealth. But we follow the balance between the environment and the economy. So let's start using sustainable economic development. Let's start using an environmental lens when we make decisions on a lot of these projects, balancing the land and the water protection with creation of job and wealth for our people.
We've got a lot to talk about and more on a busy agenda. So Chief, I appreciate you coming in today. Thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity.